So what we are witnessing over the years, which pops up now and again in the headlines, is the erosion of American unipolar military dominance of the Asia-Pacific in exchange for more of a multipolar military order. Because since the end of World War II, despite the Vietnam War, despite the Korean War, the American Navy essentially dominated the Pacific as though it was a private lake. That era is ending. It isn't only China's naval expansion. It's the gradual the gradual modernization and slow-moving enlargement of the South Korean and Japanese navies in Northeast Asia, but especially of the growth of navies in Vietnam, the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, navies that never existed before. Because though many of these places were either at war internally, in the case of Vietnam and Malaysia in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, or they weren't constituted as states in the case of Singapore up until the mid-1960s. They weren't in a quasi-pacifistic mindset like Japan in the decades following the aftershock of World War II. So now and China, of course, which was internally focused under Mao Zedong's depredations, but later even under Deng Xiaoping's opening of the economy, now all of these countries are in a more capable position of projecting power outwards because they're more institutionalized internally than they ever had been. And because they can project power outwards, they now come into disagreements about who owns what in terms of where the boundaries are in the blue waters. What does all this teach us? Let me summarize a few themes. East Asia is not really about ideas. In the West, we're consumed with ideas of liberalism, of democracy, of this, that, and the other. East Asia is still in a very nationalistic phase, where things like nationalism, the zero-sum factor of geography, still count very much. Another factor is capitalism itself. Capitalism, if it goes on successfully for enough time, leads to military acquisitions. The fact that East Asia has seen an dramatic economic growth since the 1970s, and the fact that there is now a naval, air, cyber, high-end arms race in East Asia, those two factors go together. One leads to the other. Because as a country becomes more successful or wealthier, it develops interests in the outside world that it never had before, and it wants to defend those interests with military power, and there's a matter of prestige, of status that comes into play. Where a country, now that it's wealthy, it's developed, it feels it needs a military that goes along with it. In other words, don't take Asian security for granted. For too long, journalists thought of Africa, the Middle East, and other regions as areas of war, of conflict, and East Asia was just an area of business. It was all about the business stories, Fortune, Forbes magazine, etc. That's not the case anymore. East Asia is as much a military climate as other parts of the world, except instead of a low-end, car-bombing, gritty, unconventional land war like Mesopotamia and Syria, it's more of a high-end air, naval, ballistic missile, cyber theater of operations. In addition, this does not mean at all that we're headed towards war in Asia. Of course, a war can always break out due to miscalculations, incidents that happen that get out of control, but more likely what all of this means is that we're entering a more crowded, nervous, anxious world, a world more crowded with warships, more crowded with merchant vessels. After all, globalization would not exist without container traffic. And the more globalization there is, the more container ships there are, and the more that sea lines of communication, all the major ones of which coalesce in the South China Sea, matter. And if they matter more, you need navies in order to protect them. Two other things. The pivot to Asia, which is a matter of some controversy. I would say that the pivot to Asia, or the so-called pivot, it's a natural, organic evolution of U.S. foreign policy. There was talk of a pivot to Asia as soon as the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, 25 years ago exactly. After all, Europe was settled. It was no longer America's responsibility to defend Europe because Russia was weak and chaotic and on the point of collapse, and the Soviet Union, in fact, collapsed 2 years later. But then things happened. And back then they thought, well, the U.S. should focus more on Asia. It's the centerpiece of the world economy, of the world demography, etc. But then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The United States kicked Saddam out of Kuwait. Then there was a 12-year no-fly zone over Iraq, which tied up the U.S. Navy and Air Force. Then came 9/11, the Iraq War, the Afghan War. We pulled out of Iraq. We're pulling out of Afghanistan. We're back to some new focus on Asia. So I would actually say the pivot is 25 years late in that sense. And the pivot is not really, it's about putting more U.S. diplomatic, military, economic emphasis on East Asia, so we're always there as a presence factor, so that we don't have to insert forces in case of any incident or aggression. Finally, last point to end my 10 minutes here, is the Chinese economy. That's the big X factor. I wrote a piece in the Financial Times this summer where I said there are two debates going on about China in the newspaper. One is it's a strategic naval debate about China's aggression in the South and East China Seas. And this debate is engaged by naval strategists, military strategists, and in this debate, China seems more and more powerful and unstoppable. Then there's the economic debate. What's happening with the Chinese economy? And that is engaged only by economists. And in that debate, China seems weaker and weaker and weaker. But I would say the two debates are interlinked, because the nature and the speed at which the Chinese economy, the level of growth of the Chinese economy slows down. It will still be growing, but growing at a lower rate, will at some point intersect with the strategic debate and will influence the strategic debate. So ultimately, the big unknown in Asia is just how extreme the Chinese economic upheaval will be over the coming years. And I leave you with that question as an open question. Thank you very much.